Good evening, and welcome to this BAFTA Games livestream from Creative Assembly. I'm Tokmakchiev, and I'm going to spend the next hour discussing how we make user interface for Total War. We've joined up with BAFTA Games for this livestream as part of their BAFTA Crew Games program. Creative Assembly often supports BAFTA in their work to inspire more young people into game dev careers. Right, let's start. I've been doing user interface and user experience design for the past 10 years. I've done all kinds of design, from websites and e-commerce platforms to product and software apps, online banking tools to mobile apps. Until one day I decided to follow my true passion, which is gaming, and that's how I eventually ended up here talking to you when I joined Creative Assembly. At Creative Assembly Sofia, I lead the user interface and user experience team, and we're responsible for delivering beautiful, functional, and accessible UI to our players. That's basically a very fancy way of saying that we're the department of buttons and stuff. So what is this about? Why am I talking to you? Why are you here listening? Hopefully because you want to get some value out of this, so we don't waste your time. And what are we going to talk about? What we're going to cover is the way that we create user interface for Total War. What our process is, what our pipeline is, who makes the user interface, what are they responsible for, and what roles are involved. We're going to take a look at our complete UI pipeline that we use in our day-to-day work. We're going to cover each of the different stages in detail. We're going to go through why they're important, what are we doing during them, and what the end goal of each stage is. And then at the end, we're going to have a questions and answers segment. However, because this is pre-recorded, I'm going to be in the Twitch chat. So if you have any questions during the presentation, don't hesitate to post them as a comment, and I'll do my best to answer them. So, starting with who makes the user interface. Now, you might be surprised, but it's not just the UI team. Creating UI is a very collaborative process that can involve up to a dozen different people, each from different departments with different things that they're responsible for. So let's take a quick look through them. First, everything starts with the game designers. They're the ones that conceptualize and define a feature that's gonna go into the game. That feature is gonna need user interface. So they will define it, they'll conceptualize it, they'll provide an overview of it, and then we're gonna have to basically wrap it up in clothes and make it usable. They're also responsible for the narrative and flavor writing and onboarding players, because when introducing new UI, especially to a game that's already been released, you need to teach the players what it is, how to use it, why it's important to their experience. We then have the UI designers. That's our team. That's what we do. We're responsible for doing the prototypes, creating all of the assets, that's buttons, icons, patterns, any background art. We also do animations. We implement the UI in the game, and we do UX copywriting. We have programmers who will sometimes come in and support us in order to make the UI functional and do their magic work to connect it properly, because not everything that we can't implement everything by ourselves, and we need their support. We have user researchers, a vital role, because they're responsible for organizing usability, accessibility, and user experience tests that give us valuable feedback that we can then take and use in order to design a better user interface. We have quality assurance, QAs. Again, super important because they will test the UI for technical problems, visual bugs, and also provide feedback on the gameplay experience. And we have localization people. Total War games are translated to 13 languages, which is a huge amount of text basically that needs to be localized, and they're the ones that handle all of this. And final but not least, we have the producers. They are the ones that ensure that we are on track and on time, and we're going to deliver the UI in budget and in scope. They also help us with prioritization when needed. Now that we've taken a look at very briefly what are the different roles and their responsibilities, let's go into how we make the UI. I often like to describe it as magic. But behind that magic, there's actually a very well-defined 9-step process that we call die pipeline. Now, I know that it looks like a lot, but trust me, all of it is needed. Now, the pipeline is a step-by-step process for creating UI, which clearly defines who does what when. You can think of it as a high-level to-do list that we apply whenever we start work on UI. It's split into 9 different phases. We're gonna go into each of them, and we're gonna pair them with real-life examples from Total War Troy. And during that whole pipeline, there's also one additional step that's ongoing, which is the documentation process, which we'll also talk through. Now, keep in mind that this pipeline is not, we don't apply it for every single UI task. Obviously, if we have to draw a single icon or a batch of icons that are 48 by 48 pixels, we won't go through the whole process because it would be a massive overkill. However, when implementing a new feature to the game, it's vital that we go through this in order to ensure that we'll deliver something that's actually playable and serves a good player experience. Now, you're gonna ask, why use a pipeline? I mean, why not just open up Photoshop and start designing right away and make something pretty and then take that and put it directly into the game? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. First off, it's great for onboarding. It makes it really easy to explain to new people that join your team or any of the other teams that are involved in creating the UI what it takes to actually make the UI. They can also use it as a reference whenever needed, in case that they're still into their early months, so they're not really sure, okay, what comes after the prototype stage, who should I talk to now, who's responsible for that, do I need to go to that person? It provides us with a clear path, which means that we avoid any confusion of what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. Now, this is great for defining the tasks and scoping our work. Basically, whenever we start, whenever we know that we need to create a new UI, we have all of the steps already. So we can sit down with a producer and a game designer, and we can, based on the size of the feature that we're going to be implementing, roughly figure out how long each of the steps is going to take us. But we don't need to think about the steps anymore. They're there, and we just need to define what their timeline will be. And most importantly, it eliminates ambiguity. After all, you can't start producing assets if you haven't defined what your UI is and what the layout is going to be. So we're not even going to go into that production until we've met and completed all of the steps before. It also helps us define people's roles. That means that a person that's working in some way on UI will know exactly what is expected of them. They will know who the decision makers are, the stakeholders, and who to turn to if they need help, feedback, or have a question. It also makes it easy to iterate. It gives us predictability to the process. And when we repeat it multiple times throughout a project, it allows us to extrapolate average estimates of how long something takes to be made. Let's say that we're adding 3 new faction mechanics in our next DLC. I'm not saying we are. We're taking this as a hypothetical. But when we run the pipeline 3 times, and then at the end we see how long it took us to go through all of it for the 3 different faction mechanics, we can extrapolate an average which then the producers can use in order to basically figure out, when we start our next project, how long the UI creation is going to take, even before we actually start working on it. And finally, and probably most importantly, it reduces mistakes. Because Without a process, without a clear defined process, confusion can erupt at every step. So splitting the process into multiple steps makes it easier and more likely for us to catch a problem early on, because we're not going to start testing and thinking about if that's right after we've implemented the UI. Now, we've got steps to cover that. So let's break all of those steps down now. To help us do that, we're going to take a look at one of Ajax's faction mechanics from the Ajax and Diomedes DLC for Total War Troy. Specifically, the Path to Greatness, which has Ajax challenge other warriors to non-lethal battles, where he aims to prove himself and basically show the world how great he is. And let's start with the very first step, the design brief. This is the starting point, right? So design brief is mostly the responsibility of the game designer. It is what it is them taking the feature design that they've done already and then basing themselves off on that, preparing a brief that gives an overview of the features as design, explaining how players will interact with it, what its purpose is, what are the different systems and mechanics that are going to be in it and that we will need to consider and expose to the player so that they can interact with them or inform themselves about it. So really, the goal of this step is to provide a foundation upon which a UI designer can start exploring UIs, can begin exploring UI solutions. Now keep in mind that there isn't a set requirement or a specific rule of what the design brief should be or how it should look like. Honestly, it can be anything. And we employ multiple different tools at CA to build design briefs. We're going to cover some of the most useful ones, in my opinion. But honestly, it can even be a simple 1 or 2 page document that just gives an overview of how the feature is supposed to work. So let's look at the tools now. First off, as I said, the most important one, and usually the one that we don't skip, is the feature overview. This is the quick summary of the design feature document that the designer would already have prepared. However, in this one, all of the unnecessary information is removed, and it purely focuses on how the feature plays and what its key interactions are. To produce this, you can use any text editor that you want, Word, Notepad, whatever. Now, why this is important and how it helps us? Basically because it gives us a condensed view of what the UI needs to accommodate. Now, oftentimes we also take a look at the detailed feature specification. However, it is possible that it includes information like, for example, unit statistics or some balancing or some economy information that we really don't care about and they're not relevant for the UI. So this helps us skip over that. Another useful tool that is often used are the user stories. User stories help give a general explanation of a feature, and they're usually written from the perspective of the player. Now, we use them in order to explain what the player should be able to achieve, what problem does the feature solve for them, and the value they will get out of it. Keep in mind that user stories are not an end goal. They're not a feature. They just aim to give us an idea of the player's perspective and keep the focus on the player. They basically let us put ourselves in the shoes of the player. They also keep us focused on serving the end goal experience and allow us to work together to decide how best to serve the player and meet the goal. Now, right here, you can see this is basically the user stories that were used for the Ajax mechanic. So at the very top, it's split into 4 levels. At the very top, we have a simple, straightforward sentence. As Ajax, I want to challenge and defeat formidable warriors in non-lethal battles, to get them to acknowledge my might and join my army, and increase my renown in the world. So right here, We get a very high level definition of what the future is and what the UI should serve. We know that the player is going to play as Ajax. We know that they will be challenging and defeating warriors. We know that that action will basically get them to join their army and increase their renown in the world. Renown is a specific currency that's unique to Ajax's faction. Then from there on, we can break down this. We see that for the first one, I want to challenge and defeat formidable warriors on little battles. We start breaking down. I want to see what warriors I can challenge and what I need to do so. I want to see how strong their army is so I can prepare myself accordingly. And here we already start seeing different interactions that we will need to include into our user interface. We have to provide some way for the players to see what warriors they can challenge. We have to inform them what they need to do to challenge them. Are there going to be any requirements, any cost to that? We also want to show players what they're going to be going against. So we need to show the army of the warriors so that they can prepare themselves accordingly. Then we can further break down. Let's take the warriors in the challenging. I want to see where I can find them to plan my army's route. So here we're starting to go into a little bit of the player experience in terms of, okay, how do I achieve the first task and how do I plan for it in my long-term gameplay? So we need to basically show them where those warriors will be, which cities they will populate in the world, so the player can plan their army's movement. And finally, I want to know how renowned I need to be to challenge a warrior. So basically, how famous Ajax needs to be. The next tool that we use is the prioritization. Prioritization is basically defining what is the priority of each information we want to display. Again, this is usually done by the game designer on a very high level. This is factors that go into prioritizing information include, for example, the importance of the information to the experience, how often the player will interact with it, do they need to see it at all times, for example, or is it just supporting information that can be referenced and hidden away behind some kind of a trigger? How does this help us? Well, it helps us by providing hierarchy that we can base ourselves on when designing the user interface and designing the information that we need to expose more. Where to drive the focus of the player, what should serve as supportive content. In this case, you can see a rough prioritization of what goes into the Ajax mechanic. So at the very high level, we need the mechanic explanation. That's basically showing and teaching the player how this mechanic works. We want to show them, it's very important to show them their current amount of renown, the currency. And we also want to show them the list of warriors. Afterwards, we need to serve the warrior location, the warrior statistics. And then, declining in priority are the resource and renown cost in order to challenge that warrior, their army strength, and finally, their flavor description, because we want to have a little bit of flavor so that it feels more immersive. Now, prioritization can be done in tools such as Miro, FigJam, OneNote, or Excel. Spreadsheets work very good for that. User stories as well, I forgot to mention. Any whiteboard / brainstorming tools such as Miro and FigJam are great in order to just put some sticky notes on it. And you don't even have to do it on a software. You can just use sticky notes and put them on a wall. It's perfectly fine and does the job. Afterwards, we have flowcharts. Flowcharts are basically a map of the player's interaction with the future, from start through exceptional cases to a final state. These ones we usually tend to use only for very, very complex mechanics that have multiple different branching possibilities in terms of interactions. And if it's a very straightforward mechanic, we usually skip this entirely because we don't need to serve that many cases. However, for complex ones, it helps because they provide an idea of how long the player's interaction with the future will be, what those interactions will be as well. And it also allows us to spot exception cases early on that the UI will need to handle instead of discovering them at a later stage when the UI will already have been designed, and we're gonna have to most probably redesign part of it, and at a later stage that can be costly. What you can use to create flowcharts is Microsoft's Visio, Draw.io as a free alternative, and again, the recently released FigJam. Finally, we have mockups. Mockups are definitely not required, but they're a great way to communicate a future, especially if the designer already has an idea of how the UI can look. This is basically a very, very rough visual sketch of how a designer imagines the UI will be, what elements are going to be in there, and what the interactions will be. Again, this is not something that we expect of the game designers. When we get it, obviously it's very nice because visual presentation is always best. But if the designer is not that visual, or they really are not sure how to approach the UI of a certain mechanic, that's why we're here for. That's where the next stage comes in, which is the exploration stage. Now, the exploration stage, the ball gets taken from the game designer and is given to a UI designer. At this stage, we spend some time conceptualizing what the UI could be based on the brief. We think about how to approach it by researching similar features in our own and other games, as well as brainstorming new concepts. We try to identify any potential problems and difficulties as early as possible. You can think of the exploration stage as really the research part of it all. Important things that we try and consider here is taking a look at all of the information that the game designer has provided from the previous stage. Is that new UI going to require a completely new user interface? Or can we instead integrate an already existing user interface from our game or from existing Total War title so that we reduce the time for development? Can we reuse assets that we've already produced? Or do we need to create unique new ones? In any case, the main purpose in the stage is to gather as many ideas, problems, and solutions as possible so that we can explore them in the next stage with a clear understanding of the future and its requirements. And that's the end goal. Now, two resources that are very, very helpful in this case, and I strongly recommend, are the Game UI database and the interface in game, both of which are huge online repositories with screenshots of user interface from hundreds and hundreds of games. They're free, have great filtering and search and sorting options, and they really make life a lot easier instead of having to boot up a game and go through its UI by itself. So for any quick reference, or if you need any inspiration, or if you want to see, okay, how did games handle, for example, an inventory system, you can just go to one of these and you can filter by inventory and you get hundreds of results. After the exploration stage, we go into prototyping. This is again the responsibility of a UI designer. Prototyping is basically producing inexpensive and interactive prototypes of the future. We try and focus on simple representation and fast iterations. Prettiness doesn't really matter here. We do prototypes prototypes can be done in any prototyping tool such as Adobe XD or Figma or I don't know, Photoshop files paired with InVision if you want to make your life a little bit more complex and interesting. So in this stage, what will happen is the UI designer will fire up a prototyping tool. In our case, that's XD or Figma, and they will start producing prototypes of the UI where they try to be experimental. They try to be quick and fast. The aim here is to test out ideas from the previous stage that we came to during the exploration and identify the best possible solution. Now, when creating prototypes, there are a few important guidelines that we try and follow. I'm going to show you a prototype now so that we can see it. So this is what a prototype looks like, this one specifically in Adobe XD. This is actually an early version of the Ajax Path of Greatness mechanic, a prototype that we created, which obviously looks very, very different to what we have in game currently. And that's perfectly normal. Prototypes are not meant to be what is going to be, are not meant to represent 100% accuracy what's going to be in the end game. No. Their purpose is to basically add all of the UI elements that are going to be in that UI, map the interactions that the player is going to have with them, add all of the necessary information that we're going to need to communicate to them, such as in here we can see location of warrior, army strength, unit cards to represent the various warriors that can be challenged, and so forth and so on. And when you create prototypes, we try to keep it as low fidelity as possible. We really don't care about aesthetics or how beautiful it is at this stage. We care about putting something that is interactive as fast as possible so that other people can take a look at it and we can start gathering feedback. However, we do follow some rules. Interactivity is a must. A static prototype doesn't really help us. Games are not static after all. We try to reduce the amount of placeholder text and actually add text that is going to be somewhat representative of what the final text will be, so that when we put a person to test the prototype, they don't feel lost. We are perfectly fine with using whatever placeholder art and assets there are. As I said, we don't care about aesthetics, but we're adamant about using proper tooltips, which are incremental to the experience in a grand strategy game and complex games such as Total War. And I'm going to show you a video of what a finished prototype looks like. There we go. So you can see we have hovering effects that pop up the unit information. We have also interactivity. Clicking on a unit opens up a special box for them. And during the prototype stage, oftentimes what we're going to do is, and let me just pause this real quickly. Oftentimes what we're going to do is we're going to comment directly onto the prototype. Both UI designers and game designers have access to it, and try to brainstorm or figure out if this makes sense to be here or work in that particular way. That's the end goal. The end goal of the prototype stage is to basically create a prototype. Depending on the feature, we may end up creating more than one prototypes. We've had cases where, for example, during the exploration stage, we've come to two cool ideas that we want to spend time further developing. So we're going to create prototypes for both of the ideas and see which one actually serves a better experience or makes more sense in the context of our current feature. Now, after the prototype is done, and we've done a little bit of iteration on it after we've discussed it internally, by internally I mean inside the UI team, we move on to the next stage, which is the test and review. Now, test and review is kind of like a milestone stage during the pipeline. Two important things happen here. First off, the user researcher, now this is where user researcher comes, organize internal tests with QAs and game designers so that we get feedback. What these internal tests are very standard player tests that are done often in UX design, where we're going to sit people down in front of the prototype. We're going to tell them what we want them to do. For example, in the case here of the Ajax mechanic, it was basically try and challenge a warrior. And then we're going to leave them with it and then we observe how they try and accomplish that task. During the observation, we take notes. We try not to guide the player so that we don't influence them, so that the feedback is accurate at the end, and it's not because we told them to, actually, this is where you can do that. No, we want to see if people don't get something. We want to see if a particular piece of information, for example, is not understandable. We want to see if they experience blocking at a certain point with the UI, because that's valuable feedback that we can then take in order to refine the UI before we move into the more costly stages of actually implementing the UI and creating the art for it. So at this level, we're still very early in development, and we're still going for fast, we're going for iterations, so it's perfectly fine to change a prototype, not changes to it, or even completely scrap it and make a new one. Once the prototypes are done, and once we do the user tests, we then also held a so-called review meeting, where we gather all of the stakeholders, which include the UI designer that's responsible, their lead, the game designer that owns the feature and initially conceptualized it, the programmer that's going to be supporting the feature, a QA, and a producer. A project director usually also joins the review meeting. So we gather at the review meeting and we take a long hard look at the prototype. We also take into consideration the feedback from the user tests. And at this point, we try and figure out, okay, is the current solution acceptable? Does it actually solve the goal that we initially set out to solve and provide the experience that it wanted to provide? Is there something that we need to improve or re-examine? Did something come up that sounded good on paper while we were in the exploration stage, but now that we've had people interact with it and go through it, suddenly doesn't really make sense, so maybe we should reject it. And we try and basically figure out what makes sense, what doesn't, and what we need to change. At this stage, it's also very vital to discuss the technical implementation, which is where the programmer comes in, because layout and programming costs are a factor when deciding which solution to implement, or figuring out if we need to, for example, simplify something. Because the prototype might be great, what we've created might make a lot of sense, but it might cost a lot more than we actually have budget for. So we maybe have to scope it down or think of an alternative way to go for it. Or if we really believe that that's the way we should go, then we need to negotiate an increase so that we can actually develop it. Programmers may also propose changes in order to make everyone's life easier. They're good at that. And to make their implementation also easier. And again, depending on the importance of a feature, we can do multiple repeats of the prototyping and testing and reviewing phases until we come to a solution that meets the initial brief that the game designer provided, that also provides a good player experience, is technically achievable, and doesn't exceed the budget. That's the end goal here. And this is basically what a test result looks like, just to give you a little bit of an idea of it. So when we do the player tests internally, we end up with a report at the end that prioritizes the issues that have basically come out of the test, and also provides any additional info that we may not have considered. So in the case of this prototype of the Trials of Strength that we did, we got a very high issue, which is basically that the layout caused confusion since it wasn't immediately clear that players have to click on a warrior to see their details and challenge them. We had two lower priority issues, one of them being that the minimap that we added to the UI was completely ignored and players just closed the panel and went to look for a settlement instead. And the total renown was not visible enough and was easily missed, as at the stage of the prototype we only had it in the campaign HUD, but we didn't have it visible at all times inside the faction mechanic panel. Additionally, the people that tested informed us that they would like to see all units in a warrior's army and not just their strength. So in the prototype before, let's just go back quickly to it, you can see that we had an icon and we had a number to it that was supposed to indicate, okay, this is the army strength of that warrior. So in here, that warrior has 14 units. However, the thing is that what 14 units? In Total War, an army that's 10 units but are the right 10 units and they're experienced and ranked up can completely devastate an army that's with 20 units. So the information was just not enough in order for the players to make an informed decision about whether they were strong enough to challenge that warrior. So, as I said, these test results, super important, super vital. We take them, they're reviewed in the prototype, they're reviewed together with the prototype during the stakeholders review meeting, and then we decide how we proceed forward. In the case of Ajax's Path to Greatness, what we ended up doing is making another prototype, which is something very common. And this is the second prototype. Let me play it for you. Now, as you can see, it includes changes that come directly from the feedback. We implemented a progress bar that shows at all times the renown of the player and the effects that it gives. We removed the minimap as it was underused, and we also had we also have some worries during the stakeholder meeting that in the previous prototype, the layout was done in such a way that there wouldn't be enough room for adding background art that gives the whole immersiveness to our UI. So we removed that. We took all of the units, all of the warriors, and we put them together in a list. And we removed the extra interaction of having to click on a warrior in order to be able to challenge them. Instead, exposing the action of challenging them at all times, as long as the player has the resources for it and the renown. So what we ended up doing, we removed one extra interaction. We made the UI more consistent. We opened up more space for art. And we also added the option to preview what units are in the army and not just the army strength by itself. You can see that when I hover here on the army strength icon, which opens up a little tooltip that basically shows all the units in the army, and then you can hover on each unit individually to see their stats. And at this stage, you can also see that we've also implemented proper tooltips, like for example, informing the player that they don't have enough resources or they don't have enough renown to challenge the champion. But all of the interactions are there. The prototype serves the purpose and basically follows the brief as defined. Now, again, a new prototype. So we do another set of testing and reviewing. This time the test results come a bit different. Oops, there we go. So first off, because we tested both with players, with people who had tested the previous prototype and new ones, we managed to get feedback that compared the two, and players thought that the new layout is much more straightforward, and they had no issue with starting a challenge with a warrior. However, they did raise a flag that locating a warrior on the campaign map would take too long, and that browsing warriors becomes cumbersome in mid to late game, because when you have 60 or 70 turns in, there may be a lot more warriors than initially. So we're displaying just 3 of them at a time, and you have to scroll a lot in order to find a warrior, a specific warrior that you want to challenge. Now, taking those results, however, we said that, okay, that's good enough, and we can move into proper implementation in the game. Now, an implementation phase is, again, goes back directly to UI designer, and it's taking that final prototype after it's, again, reviewed and tested, and implementing it into the game with our proprietary UI tool that we use at Creative Assembly. At this stage, the goal is to have an implemented UI in-game that has all functionality that can be achieved without code support. Again, placeholder assets and text can be used in order to get the layout in the game as fast as possible. And this is what it looks like when we start actually building it for the game. And at this stage, while the UI designer implements it, we also do our best to document it. The documentation, however, starts at an earlier stage, and it's an ongoing thing, but we'll cover documentation specifically a bit later. So, okay, we have the prototype, it's green lighted, we open up our tool, we start implementing it. During implementation, it starts looking more and more what the end result will be. And once we have it in the game, we move to code support. At the code support stage, programmer comes in, they apply their amazing development magic skills and basically take our UI and hook it up to the game so it works properly and people can actually play it. Now we don't leave programmers all by themselves to do that. We try and help them as much as possible. In order to do this, we provide them with detailed documentation that basically explains all of the different functionalities of the UI, any specific cases that need to be acknowledged, and code support is needed for them. And oftentimes at this stage, programmers will discover some additional player experience case that we haven't thought about, or they will propose cool improvement to the interface, which more times than not we end up implementing. And the goal at the end is to have a fully playable and functional UI in game. The code support documentation we do it in Confluence. It's usually something like this. We try and document every single component and break down the UI. So in here you can see that we are breaking down the cards that represent the warriors, and we explain, okay, this is a champion unit card. So in the champion unit card, image is going to have to be loaded of the warrior. We have a champion name, we have champion locations. So champion names will probably have to be linked to the database that has all the different champions. Location based on where game designers will set them to populate settlements into the world. We have a place where we want to display flavor text, the place for the army size, and so forth and so forth and so forth. We also try and explain any specific cases where like here where we have different states for the champion cards. So we have an unknown one before it's discovered. We have a discovered one after the player has found where that warrior is, and now they can see their cost, and they can challenge them if they have enough resources and renown. And we have a defeated state. This is after they've been challenged. Most of the information becomes no longer relevant, so we just take it away and we mark that champion as defeated and challenged. So boom, players don't have to think about it anymore. And at this stage, at the code support stage, a UI designer will also do a review after the code support is finished in order to check if everything is working as expected, and we return feedback if necessary. In the case of Ajax, we had an issue where one of the champion states were where after the champions was challenged, their unit card would completely disappear and the go to location button would get squashed for some reason. So, we try and test the UI that we do and the implementation before we give it to QAs and before we go into doing playtests, because most of the times things are very obvious and they're easy to catch and fix at this stage. During the code support stage, so code support and asset creation, they go hand in hand. Like we do them in sync because one is not dependable on another. While a programmer is hooking up the UI, a UI designer can go and they can draw whatever and produce whatever is necessary. We have icons, backgrounds, textures, components, visual effects, animations. Most of these we create in the Adobe Creative Suite. And the end goal of this is basically to not have any placeholders, right? If we create stuff like icons that are supposed to represent, for example, skills or buildings, or that have a particular game mechanic behind them, or they influence the gameplay in a certain way, game designers will usually provide us with an assets brief, which is a very, very simple brief based on a template we have in Confluence, where they're gonna list all of the assets that they need, what their type is, a little bit of a design direction explanation. For example, okay, you can see here that for Ajax, the first icon is a buff for infantry and giants. These are skill icons, by the way, for Ajax's skill progression. And they should be two proud warriors, one of them being a giant and noticeably taller. They can also provide a reference to either an existing asset in the game or to an external image, a particular pose of a character if they want to have, or if we're making an icon to represent a certain weapon, they can give us a photo of or a 3D model of that weapon. And then we produce them. As I said, asset creation is done in Adobe's Creative Suite. Most of the art in Total War we do in Illustrator and in Photoshop. Here you can see the background art that we've created for the Path of Greatness mechanic, and a little bit below it for the Warrior of Renown, which is Ajax's other mechanic. And again, assets really can be anything. Here you can see just some of the assets that we had to produce for Ajax's mechanic. So we have a faction widget icon, which is on the button that triggers the mechanic. We have an icon that represents the renown currency. We have a progress bar specifically for renown. We have a background art, animated event picture. We have an icon that's put on settlement plates in order to indicate that in that settlement there is a champion that can be challenged, or as we later call them, paragons. And with this, we've basically come to a point where we fairly confidently can say have a good version of the UI in game. Now, after code support and asset production is done, the UI designer and the lead UI designer and the game designer will do another review to check if everything is okay. They will also play a bit with the finished version of the UI in game, just to get a feel for it, because I mean, prototype is one thing, but then having it exactly in the game, very different, and provide any feedback. And if necessary, we do changes. Again, the changes that we do at this level are most likely polishes or quality of life things. At this stage, we've dedicated ourselves to following this particular UI. So changing the whole UI is very unlikely unless we start receiving very, very, very critical and negative feedback about it. After the assets creation, comes copywriting. Copywriting is split between the UI designer and the game designer. It's basically similar to asset creation. Its main goal is to prepare all required text for final review and localizations and get rid of any placeholder text that we might have. The UI designer will handle the UX copywriting, while the game designer will handle flavor text and any narrative writing that needs to be done. Now, for those unaware, this is basically a very rough example of how UX copywriting differs from narrative or flavor writing. So you can see here that we have, for the UI designer, we have a tooltip which says to challenge paragons, you must first prove your renown to the world. See the renown panel for details. And then below we have another tooltip that says left click to zoom to this paragon's location. So basically what the UI designer is responsible for is writing the text that in some way directly addresses the player and addresses a particular action or a block of that action and tells them why something can be done, why something can't be done. So this is kind of like, with this text, we break the immersiveness in order to serve the player experience and make sure that they know at all times what they can do or why they can't do something, for example. Whereas the game designer, we write, for example, the flavor descriptions of the warriors of here of Alius, which is that he's a fearsome warrior said to be descended from Poseidon himself, and he possesses his alleged ancestors' callousness and appetite for the suffering of others, right? So they will try to immerse the player more with their writing, whereas we try to make the player experience more functional with ours. After all the text is done, it's compiled in one huge spreadsheet like this, and then it's sent off first for final editing, and then for localization into the 13 different languages that we support in Total War. Now at this stage, after copywriting has been done, after assets have been produced, after we had our code support link, then basically everything is in the game. We're going to move to another set of playtests. This is, now the UI is basically ready for final testing. Testing here is split into, it's basically a few different tests that we do. So game designers in QA, and we rigorously test the complete feature and provide feedback. That will be monitored by the user research team, obviously, and they will compile feedback based on it. And additionally, and highly recommended if you have the opportunity, we tend to do that in CA. We arrange tests with external players now, that people outside of the development team, to gather additional data and test the ideas that we've had. This is the final stage, but keep in mind that this is still an iterative process. So the results generated during the playtest here are again often used to redefine one or more problems, one or more existing problems. They may shed some light on something that we skipped or somehow missed. Just because we have this 9-step UI pipeline doesn't mean that we have the answer to all problems from the start, or that we will serve the perfect solution at the first go. So so that's why it's important to allow ourselves to have some time to do an additional work on this. So basically, our goal here is to see how the players will react to the final feature. We want to see how they think, we want to see how they feel, how they behave. And then we want to use that in order to empathize and further improve our future. So just because this is the final step in the pipeline, it doesn't mean that the UI is done. No, work continues. So we gather that feedback from the playtests, and we use it in order to polish the user interface and experience, fix any newfound issues and bugs that we have. And alterations and refinements are quite likely to come up and be made at this stage. In the case of Ajax, one of the main things that came out of this is this little panel that we added above the province panel, where we basically had some players that shared with us that while they knew the location of a particular warrior from the faction mechanic panel, they wanted to know which champion was in which settlement without having to open that faction mechanics panel. So, for example, while they were playing their game on the campaign map, they would come across a settlement, and if that settlement had a warrior, they wanted to know so that they don't have to constantly go back and forth to the faction mechanic panel to see their location. So they click on the province panel, and we started showing them which exactly is the warrior that's in that province. And we also allow them to challenge the warrior directly from here without having to open the faction mechanics panel. Now, some might say, okay, but doesn't this defeat the purpose of the panel? No, it just gives an alternate way and a different experience. Some players will still use the faction mechanics panel, others will use this. Both are very, very valid. And this is an important takeaway. Even if you have one takeaway to get from all of this that I've said so far, make this the most important one. Options are incredibly important. Options provide accessibility to players and allow them to have the experience that they want and not be streamlined and put into one that we've thought and decided is the best for them. So yeah, we ended up adding this as a quality of life update, and after we released the DLC, that's exactly what happened. Some players used the faction mechanic panels, some never even opened it or opened it just once, and then were perfectly fine with using it with challenging warriors from here. And then we come to the thing that is not really a step, but it's an ongoing through the whole pipeline. It's the documentation. The documentation is the UI designer and the game designer are responsible for it. The game designer initially starts it by creating the design brief, and then the UI designer basically updates it at different stages. During the prototype stage, after we've defined the prototype and we've agreed on that prototype is documented. Then after tests, any feedback is documented and added. Any changes that happen to the prototype or any new prototype that we made, it's done there as well. It's a living document, it's constantly updated. Once we have a prototype and we start into implementation, we add any implementation specifics. We add a breakdown of the user interface once we have, once we're 100% certain what will be in the user interface. We also describe what the flow of the player will be. We add any tooltips and any text strings and any assets that are part of it. And the end goal is to basically have a clear and up-to-date documentation that can be referenced at any point by anyone during the development of the UI or even 2 years afterwards if someone needs to check something or use something from that UI. And this is where I show you a video of the final faction mechanic in-game. This is what we shipped in-game. The Path to Greatness, where you can see it now with a proper art, no placeholder text, no placeholder art, all of the tooltips, all of the functionality. And we even, that's something I forgot, we implemented a sorting functionality, so in order to make it easier to discover warriors instead of just scrolling. So we gave the ability to players to sort by army strength in case they wanted to see, okay, which are the weakest ones that I can challenge right away with my current army strength, for example. To finish off, if you're interested, you can go to creativeassembly.com. We have dozens and dozens of different positions that you can check, from UI positions to programming to design to marketing to product and producer. Check them out and follow us also on Twitter at CA Games. And if you want to learn more about UI in games, I highly recommend visiting wecanfixitinui.com, which is a huge online repository created by industry UI industry veterans, which includes resources on UI in games, books, insights, references and resources where you can learn about UI, and also career advice on how you can start doing UI for games and going into the industry. And that's about it. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, just shoot and I'll do my best.